Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Affordable Housing Development for Newer Nonprofits. This webinar is the first of a series of newer developers of affordable rental housing program that we're trying to put together here at HUD. Again, I am Minnie Monroe Baldwin, and I work in the Office of Recapitalization, which is a division of the Multifamily Housing Office. As a small or relatively new nonprofit, you may experience unique challenges in developing and delivering affordable rental units. Challenges around how much experience you have or your capacity to develop, or maybe your organization is challenged by a need for better understanding of the development process, the timelines associated with developing, or we all know how important it is to know the ins and outs of financial resources available to fund projects. Do these sound like challenges that you may have faced? Well, today we're going to hear from two nonprofit organizations who have agreed to share their experiences surrounding these types of challenges and many others that come into creeping into the space of completing a project. Listen for tips, ideas, even some just basics and fundamentals about developing affordable rental housing. We hope you find the sessions valuable. We hope you find them inspiring. And most of all, I personally hope this session assures you that with knowledge and insight, most challenges can be conquered. Today's session will be moderated by Greg Kloss. Greg is a senior manager at ICF. He has many years of experience in affordable housing and HUD programs. Today's panelists are Jeff Johnson, and Jeff is the executive director of Mile High Ministries in Denver, Colorado. We also have Mary Cohen, and Mary is from Vermont. She is the executive director of Housing Trust of Rutland County, Vermont. Mary and Jeff, on behalf of HUD, thank you so much for agreeing to share your experiences with us today. And now I'll turn the program over to Greg. Greg?
Hi, everyone. I'm Gregory Kloss with ICF, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank Minnie Monroe Baldwin and HUD's Office of Recapitalization for the opportunity to host this webinar. Next, we're going to ask everyone a brief poll question, which is, how many affordable rental housing properties have you or your organization developed? Choices are 0, 1 or 2, 3 or 4, or 5 or more. So I'll pause here for just a minute to let you submit your answers.
Folks, you should see the polling panel show up on your screen on the right side. Just make sure you choose your answer and then hit the submit button. And the poll results are now up.
Do we still have a few more people? It looks like who haven't answered quite yet, so I'll give it a few more seconds.
The poll is now closed.
Perfect. Thanks, John. Okay, so HUD knows that there are a lot of smaller nonprofit and mission-driven organizations out there that are potentially interested in developing affordable housing, but that don't have a lot or maybe don't have any previous experience developing affordable housing and maybe don't have a good understanding as to what it takes to develop an affordable housing project, or maybe don't even know where to begin. And well, it would be nice if HUD could put together a step-by-step instruction manual. It really isn't how it works. There's just too many variations. Every project is different in terms of project size, project scope, population served, obstacles to development, and funding needs. So instead, we're going to provide you with some realistic insights from people like yourselves who have already walked the path and who have figured out how to successfully develop an affordable housing project. As Minnie mentioned, we have with us today Jeff Johnson, Executive Director of Mile High Ministries, who recently broke ground on Clara Brown Commons in Denver, Colorado, and Mary Cohen, Executive Director of the Housing Trust of Rutland County, Vermont, who recently completed development of her project, Lincoln Place. Some of the topics that we're going to cover today include how the idea for these projects came about, how long it took to convert that idea into a viable project, some of the challenges that they've encountered along the way, how these projects were funded, and finally, some strategies that organizations that are new to development can use to learn more about affordable housing development and get involved. So, without further ado, I'd like to start by having Jeff and Mary tell us a little bit about themselves and their organizations. Jeff, would you mind starting us off?
I'd be happy to. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here with you. Mile High Ministries is a 34-year-old organization we're a faith-based organization, a small organization with about 15 staff members. We began as a street outreach 34 years ago, and then as we got to know our neighborhood and our city better, we began to do community development work. We've done legal aid, a lot of small business creation over the years. We've had a number of housing programs, but we've not been a developer of housing. We've bought some facilities, moved in, and most recently, people know us for a supportive housing community for formerly homeless families in an old motel.
Thanks, Jeff. Mary, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself and Housing Trust of Rutland?
Sure, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here today. I can tell you that the Housing Trust of Rutland County also has been in existence for almost 30 years. However, I have only been at the helm for 2, so my learning curve has been pretty dramatic over the past 2 years. We serve Rutland County, which has a population of about 60,000 people. So fairly rural with a city center that is about 16,000. And I look forward to our discussion today.
All right, great. Let's talk a little bit about the projects themselves. Jeff, would you mind telling us a little bit about Clara Brown Commons, where it's located, project size, number of units, population served, and the current status of your development?
Yes, so we're building, we have a city block on which we're building 61 affordable apartments for rent, and then we're partnering with Habitat for Humanity, who will build 17 townhomes for sale. And then in a third phase, we'll build an early childhood education center. And it's in Northeast Denver in a lower income neighborhood that is facing a lot of gentrification pressure, where it's really important that we have some affordable housing so that people who live in the neighborhood can stay here.
And Mary, could you give us an overview of Lincoln Place, please?
Sure. Lincoln Place is an old Catholic school that has been shut down for several years. And we house there, we have created 19 units, micro units and 1 bedrooms. Of the 19, we have committed 10 to those who have experienced who are experiencing homelessness. It is a energy efficient, incredibly beautiful building. It looks just like it did in 1951 when it was built, due to some historic preservation funding that went into it. And it's been a great addition to our community.
Thank you. So, Jeff, let's go back to you for a moment. And could you talk to us about how the idea for your project came about, and how did that idea for a project evolve into an actual project?
Sure. Well, the idea has been in process for quite a long time, because the project is in the neighborhood where I live. I've lived here for over 30 years. And, but it was, gosh, I guess now 18 years ago that I was walking my dog in the neighborhood and walking around this property that I knew well. It was a super blighted piece of property, a city block, again, with 32 one-bedroom apartments on the property, only 3 of which were occupied. So you can sort of imagine what happens when you have almost an entire block unoccupied, and all the crime and violence, extremes of violence that took place on the block. So I began to ask my neighbors, why is it like this? Who owns this property, and can we do something about it? And found out that the property was owned by really a notorious slumlord in our state, up in the Front Range of our state, somebody who's politically active, an attorney who likes going to court with people. So it was just, he had intimidated the neighborhood and intimidated our local government, and was just getting away with having this vacant property. And so we started dreaming. As I mentioned, we're people of faith. We're a faith-based organization. So we started praying that God would liberate the property from this guy. It took a long time for that to happen, because that was in 2004 when we started those conversations. We continued through all those years with little progress until 6 years ago, when the city finally was able to take the property away from its owner. And then they had to put the property up for auction. They couldn't just give it to somebody to develop. So they put it up to auction, and 20 different developers tried to buy the property. We're close to downtown, so it's a really attractive piece of land, and developers had all sorts of ideas about what could go on the property. We were fortunate that a wealthy supporter of ours went to the auction, purchased the property, and has held it for 5 years for us for $1 a year, until we could raise the money then to buy it and develop it ourselves. So that's just been a really long process. And as far as the vision for what we did, because I'm a neighbor, the community engagement part has been really joyful and vigorous, because we're engaging with people that I know and live around. And so we've done a lot of community meetings. The vision sort of grew up within the neighborhood. The neighborhood told us what should happen there, and but it wasn't hard to predict what that would be, and that is, we need affordable housing in Denver badly, and in our part of town. So the neighborhood kind of dreamed it into existence, and they limited also what we could do. We wanted a 5-story building, and the neighborhood asked us if we would build a 4-story. They would take the trade-off of a little bit less housing for a little bit less imposing building. And so that was a good process, and that's kind of how the vision for it came about.
Thanks, Jeff. Mary, could you talk to us about how the idea for Lincoln Place came about?
Sure. The conversation started probably about 4 or 5 years ago now, with a community collaboration that we call here in Rutland Project Vision. Project Vision is a lot of nonprofit organizations, for-profit businesses, agencies, the police department, city hall, everybody getting together and realizing that we had a homelessness issue in our communities, and how could we address that. And we knew that as the housing organization that we couldn't do that alone. So we started talking to some partners. The Homeless Prevention Center is one of them, Rutland Mental Health to help with supportive services, and then the Rutland Housing Authority, which is the provider of subsidies for low-income residents. My predecessor, who was the one who found the actual site, was reviewing different properties that could be a potential for this project. And she was outside of the Immaculate Heart of Mary School, and behind a bush near the front door was a mattress, a water bottle, and a retainer. And she said to herself, boy, we've got to get this person inside this house. You know, people find themselves homeless who never thought that they would, but we were trying to address this issue. And so that's how this particular property kind of got chosen. It was an appropriate building to be repurposed in our community. It had sat vacant for quite some time. And with some creative thought and a really good architect, 19 units were built.
And so what's the status of the project today, Mary?
The property, we had our first lease up the week of Thanksgiving last year. So we're almost on our 1-year anniversary. It has been fully leased. I think by January, we had everybody in there, and it's been a great success so far.
So what was the timeline from, if you could describe the timeline for getting this project built?
So that, you know, again, the conversation started about 3 years before we actually broke ground. We broke ground in January of 2021, and then we had an 11-month process. But you know, it didn't take 11 months. It really took almost 4 years for the idea to come to fruition totally.
Thanks. Jeff, what's the status of Clara Brown Commons?
Well, we're under construction, and we're at a fun part of the construction where every day it seems like there's big changes that happen. And so the elevator shaft has just gone up in the last couple of days, and that's encouraging for the neighborhood because people can really see now that something is happening. And in terms of go ahead.
I was just going to say about with respect to the pre-development timeline, how would you describe that?
Yeah. It's not necessarily my favorite part to think about because it is such a slow process, you know, and as a rookie in this, I had no idea that it would take this long for the pre-development work. But the process of getting site control took a long time, in part because we had a problematic property owner previously. And so there were lawsuits and all sorts of issues that the city had to go through to deal with all of that. Once we got site control, you know, then it took a long time to raise the money. We had to raise about $5.5 million of private philanthropy to cover land costs for this project, which is a lot. That's a lot of money to raise. But then, of course, also to go through, you know, the process for getting the low-income housing tax credits and et cetera, all the other funding that came along with that. So it's been about, that whole process has taken about 3 years to bring us to the point where we're at today. And of course, in the middle of that, we also had a pandemic and then the escalating costs of building housing. So it has been a really challenging 3 years.
So what experience did you have developing affordable housing prior to this project?
Well, I had none. I mean, we had renovated some buildings before. We renovated this old motel, just using private charitable funds to do that. We had renovated a few houses, single-family homes along the way in our neighborhood, but I had no experience with tax credits, no experience with state or federal or city funding for any of this kind of work, virtually no experience with working with the architects and engineers and all of that we've been doing. So early on, I sat in a lot of meetings trying to act like I knew anything that people were talking about, and just nodding my head, and then later going and having to do, you know, look everything up and figure out what they were talking about.
How about you, Mary? What was your experience in affordable housing development prior to Lincoln Place?
Yeah, Jeff, I had that imposter complex as well, sitting at some of those tables when I first started. I had my experience, I worked at a NeighborWorks of Western Vermont, which is a housing organization, but it was all about home ownership, and we didn't do any development I was on the board of the organization that I currently work for, so I knew that we did projects like this, but as far as development, and as Jeff, just like you said, working with architects and engineers and site control and a lot of acronyms that you had to quickly go learn what they were, for sure. So none.
So how else did your lack of previous development experience affect your ability to make this project a reality?
Well, I will say in my case, I came on the scene just as the funding was closing, so we had gotten my predecessor had gotten all the funding lined up, but I had to take the project through construction. And not only through construction, but we also had to create a lot of MOUs between the partners, the support services that were there, the Homeless Prevention Center. So I had to handle that as the project was being built.
Jeff, how about you? Did your lack of experience affect your ability to turn this project into a reality?
Well, sure. I mean, there were a lot of points, I'm sure, where all the various professionals helping us had to slow down and let me catch up. But, to be honest with you, I think the main effect it had was probably positive in the sense that I didn't get discouraged and give up because I didn't know how, like as we were leaning into all this pre-development work, if I'd have had any idea how long and hard this was going to be and how expensive, I might have said, oh, let's do something simpler. And some people said to us, you picked a very complicated piece of property to develop and you're doing it in a complicated way. Maybe you want to do something simpler with your life. And if I'd have known what they meant, I might have agreed with them. But so I think my inexperience kept us going in a sense. And it might have even generated some goodwill because I think maybe people just thought, this plucky little nonprofit has no idea what they're getting into. Let's see if we can help them.
Well, when did you start thinking about putting together a development team? And is a development team really necessary? And who needs to be on that team?
Oh yeah, it's really necessary. The best thing that happened for us, I had a dear friend who'd been a mentor for me who had developed a lot of affordable housing here in Denver. And his name is Ray Stransky, and he co-founded an organization called Hope Communities. Ray had actually written one of the very first low-income housing tax credit proposals in our state, maybe in the country. And so he had deep experience. So when it looked like this thing might happen, I asked Ray if we could have a cup of coffee and he could give me some advice. And that cup of coffee just developed into a partnership, and he became at first a volunteer friend and encourager, and then an advisor, and then our developer. But Ray, as I say, he had just retired, and so he didn't come with a development firm behind him. He didn't have a staff to call on. It was really just Ray and I figuring out what we needed to do. So, over time, we had to hire the other professionals to come and help us. The attorneys, Ray told me early on, he said, you're going to spend a lot of money on attorneys. And I said, oh, I don't think so. We're just not that kind of organization. Well, we have spent a lot of money on attorneys because that's part of what the work that has to be done.
So Mary, I know you kind of came in the middle of the project. Do you have anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I will say that the development team is so critically important. And as the new person in the group, and we're talking about an architect, the construction management team, we also had a hired consultant, project developer, similar to Jeff's experience, who was incredibly knowledgeable. And when Jeff described how, the team kind of slowed down to let me catch up, and we also hired a project development coordinator. We were both new, and not only were we new, we really wanted to learn. We didn't want them to just do it for us. We wanted to learn how to do this. The project ended up being very successful because we had those professionals around us to help us fill in those blanks.
So who do you choose What do you look for in a development consultant?
We're fortunate to have a couple around the state that are extremely experienced, know the ins and outs of how to navigate funding sources, compliance, good legal team, just the steps that we need to take. There's also an organization in Vermont called Evernorth, and they support small housing organizations through development. We go in as co-general partners, but then they exit the project after 15 years. So that's another option for us. So I guess it depends on, the experience that the consultants bring to the table.
Jeff, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I would say knowledge, Mary referred to the funding aspect of it, and specifically, I would say the low-income housing tax credit process. To have somebody who really, that's a process that you can't fake your way through. You really have to know something about that process. And of course, I knew nothing. So having Ray was really critical. I remember early on, we did a design charrette that the Affordable Housing Trade Organization in our state sponsored, and that's Housing Colorado and the University of Colorado. So they awarded us with this charrette. We had graduate students and various professionals who came around to help us get kind of the first layer of design in place for the project. And in that process, I got up in front of the group, really just knowing so little about how all this worked. And I said, I don't think we want to do the low-income housing tax credits. That just looks too complicated and difficult. We'll find the money somewhere else. And a guy got up after me and he said, no, you won't. That's where you're going to find your funding, is in low-income housing tax credits. So I thought, well, I'll show you. But he showed me because that is exactly where we went for our funding, because that's critical to the process most of the time, maybe not every time, but in the vast majority. So that piece is really, really important. And then the second piece for us, or another piece I mentioned, is finding an architect and a construction management company that have experience also with the tax credits, because designing and building is different when the funding is coming from tax credits. There's a lot of considerations that need to be taken into the plan.
So let's talk a little bit more about funding sources. And what did you initially anticipate using as your funding sources, and how did that change over time? And Jeff, I'll let you start, and then we'll switch back to Mary.
Okay. Well, I mentioned that we knew we were going to have to raise a lot of money. We were going to have a high land cost. And of course, many affordable housing projects begin with very inexpensive land, or even free land offered by the municipality. But we were paying a premium for this land. Of course, the reason we did that is because this land was the point of it. We wanted to develop this piece of land so that it didn't just become market rate housing. So we paid a premium. We knew we'd have to raise a lot of money. We thought we could raise a lot more. We started by thinking we could raise $10 or $12 million, and we knew that'd be hard. And then as we got into it, we realized that there isn't a tradition, either in our faith tradition or within the foundation community. Not much money is given in private philanthropy to build affordable housing. Some people think, well, that's the government's job. Some people think, well, that's the marketplace's job. So it's difficult in that middle space to raise money. So we started off thinking we'd raise 10 to 12 million. We raised 5.5 million, which we're very happy about and thrilled about it, actually. But then we also, did the process to get low-income housing tax credits. We tried to get 9% tax credits in our first application, and we failed in that round, which is normal. It was disappointing, but then we learned, that that's pretty normal to fail first time around. So then we applied for 4% tax credits, and we succeeded, and we're glad. That worked out really well for our particular piece of property. So we got the 4% tax credits. Then we got the loan/grants from the city, which are home funds from HUD, and then also our state of Colorado, Department of Local Affairs gave us a loan/grant. So that's where the funding has come from.
And so just for perspective, what are your total development costs? You said you raised $5 million through charitable giving, but what's the total project development cost?
About $27 million, and we raised $5.5 million. We have $14 million of tax credits between the federal and the state. And then the state gave us $1.5 million, and the city gave us $1.8 million.
And have you been impacted by inflation?
Ooh, wow. Yeah, we've had numerous meetings with our architect and contractor, in which the price has gone up by $1 million over the course of one meeting. I mean, we come in with a new round of budget, and the contractor says, the price of steel and wood has gone up so much that the project will cost $1 million more. That's happened to us twice. So then you have to begin a whole new round of value engineering, which is really painful.
And my understanding is you've also had to go back to some of your lending sources and request additional or supplemental funding from them as well. Is that correct?
Yes, and everybody's been super supportive of that. I mean, everybody knows what's happening, and they know that those additional costs are not because we've been careless or extravagant. It's just that this is what's happening, and these projects won't get built if everybody doesn't do more. So people have been very supportive. All the various funders have been supportive.
Mary, how is Lincoln Place funded?
Lincoln Place is similar to Jeff, although Jeff, I'm so impressed with $5 million in philanthropy. That's really awesome. Good for you. We don't go down that path often for our projects. We need the support of the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, which is kind of the mother housing organization, is what I'd call it here in Vermont. They support affordable housing projects all over. There is a network of 12 affordable housing organizations throughout the state. So they are the ones who administer the home funds and some of the other state allocations that come from the legislature. We also have done community block grants. Vermont Community Development Program administers the community block grants, so we add that piece in there. And then we have the low-income housing tax credits. Lincoln Place was just under $7 million to build. And I think it was over $4 million in the low-income housing tax credit equity that we raised. And then the rest came from the state and federal sources that come through the state.
So, Mary, if you don't have a lot of development experience, is it challenging to get in front of lenders and investors? And what does it take to be credible in the eyes of lenders and investors?
Well, I think, what Jeff had said earlier, that the first time you go up in front, you have to be perfect. I mean, these funds are so competitive. These application rounds are so competitive, and there's a lot of organizations, private and nonprofits, competing for the same funds to create housing. So it's very likely that the first time you do go in front of a 9% application round that you won't get it, because they can only fund so many. There's just so many available. The 4% are a little bit easier, a little less competitive, but you don't raise as much equity. So that's why the 9% are more competitive, because you can raise more equity. And it's challenging, and you have to if you don't make it this round, you have to kind of adjust, go to a different funding source, see if there's any more that you can get from there, and then inevitably you may have to wait for the next round of 9% tax credits or application rounds. It's challenging.
So, Jeff, how do you, if you don't have a balance sheet, can you still get in front of, are lenders and investors willing to talk to you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one of the things that helped us in our particular situation was that the property itself was compelling. It had been such a problematic property in our city. I think people wanted to do something, really wanted to see something happen there. So they were willing to work with us, and I think they were willing to work with a small nonprofit like ours because we were taking on such an important project. I was just thinking about something that Mary said, how, you go after certain sources of funding and you get some of it, you don't get others, you get less than you might have hoped for, and then you have to make adjustments. And I remember a moment standing out on the street in our city, getting a call from Ray, my development partner, and him telling me about, costs were going up and some of the income was coming down, and we were going to have to make hard decisions about affordability. And that was the whole thing for us, is to have a genuinely affordable project that our neighbors could afford. And that kind of negotiation that you have to do, and it gets very granular, where you're just going, what if we bump this apartment up just a little bit from 40% AMI to 50% AMI, but then can we cut something over here? There's just a lot of that is kind of putting this big puzzle together until suddenly, click, the numbers work, and you've got something that makes sense. And you do probably have to give some things up along the way to get it all to work.
I just want to add to what you're saying, Jeff, as well, is that having a really good story helps. Having impact in the community in which you want a project, having, repurposing a building, who it is that you're going to serve. When you go up in front of these application rounds, there are people on the other side of that table, and they care. So having a really compelling story and impact matters as well.
Mary, would you share the story a little bit with us?
Well, I did kind of at the beginning with the mattress outside the front of the door. That was a real person that was camping out there, and we see that in our communities all around the country. Homelessness is real, and it's extremely unfortunate. And we want, our mission is to get safe, affordable housing for everyone. And so it was kind of a no-brainer for us.
Jeff, how important is the backstory behind Clara Brown Commons, and can you share that story with us?
Yes. Well, in addition to the fact that it was owned by a very problematic person for 35 years, he had had this property for 35 years. So it had been a problem property for a long time and made life really difficult for the neighbors surrounding that property. So that's been very motivating for the people in our community. Naming the property for Clara Brown has also, I think, been energizing for people. Clara Brown is perhaps the most interesting and inspirational person in the state, in the history of the state of Colorado. She was born into slavery around 1800 and purchased her own freedom before the Civil War in about 1856, and then came out here to Colorado with the gold rush, searching for the family that she had been taken away from, searching for her own family. And she started doing laundry for miners, and then buying properties, and then made herself wealthy, built a modest fortune, and then became one of our state's philanthropists. Just a remarkable person, faced enormous obstacles from beginning to end. And then at the very end of her life, when she was 82 years old, was reunited with her daughter, from whom she had been separated, almost 50 years prior. So it's a remarkable story that people are beginning to know in Colorado. I mean, of course, people have known her story for a long time, but not widely. And now I feel like people are really starting to pay attention to her story, and we were glad to honor her with our project.
All right, so I've got a couple more questions, and then we'll try and take a couple of questions from our audience if there's time. So let's switch gears to talk about partnering for a minute. If you're an inexperienced developer, does it make sense to try and partner with a more experienced developer? And what does it take to attract the interest of an experienced developer?
Want me to start?
Yeah,
Sure.
Go ahead, Mary.
So we have, again, we have the options of hiring a consultant to do our development, or we can partner with the organization called Evernorth. The advantages of partnering with Evernorth are the shared risk. We become co-general partners in the project, like I had mentioned earlier, and then after a 15-year period, they bow out of the partnership. But they share the risk in that, there's a lot of pre-development monies that are spent, and until you get to the closing on the project, those are all those monies are at risk. And the Evernorth supplies the capital for that for us. So if we were short of capital for the pre-development expense that the architect does, or all the environmental work that has to be done, they put up the cash for us. We still, if the project doesn't go through, we would still owe half of that, but at least we wouldn't have to come up with the capital. And conversely, when we hire a consultant, the consultant doesn't come with that capital. We have to beg, borrow, and steal it in any way that we can until we get to closing. Again, putting the organization at risk as we spend these monies for pre-development. So there's a lot of go, no go opportunities when you're in pre-development. And how to attract it, I guess, Greg, it would be the interest of the project. Is it a good project? Does it make sense? Can we make this pencil out well?
So sometimes I've heard that organizations either share or give up a portion of the developer fee, or sometimes developers are able to bring land to the transaction, and those sorts of things can be of interest to a more experienced partner. Jeff, what's your experience?
Well, it was very similar to what Mary just described, and we began with Ray as a consultant, and we presumed that one of our first decisions would be to pick a development partner that we'd work with. But as Ray listened to us talk about what we wanted to do in our future, where we thought that this might take us, one of the things Ray observed is that we needed to learn this process, this development process ourselves. And he thought there's probably no better way for us to learn it than to just jump in and do it. And with him as a very seasoned consultant, he believed we could get it done. Though we would have to, as he said, your whole organization is going to have to raise your level of sophistication about how this process works. Not just the people working directly on it, everybody is going to have to do that. And so a couple of things motivated us. We wanted to be able to keep a portion of that developer fee to help launch us into whatever our next project would be. And then we wanted to learn by doing. So we decided to be our own developer on it. I'm glad we did, but I will say it made it vastly more difficult and challenging. And so many times, I've seen along the way, if our partner was a large development organization, they would have the staff to do a lot of the things that Ray and I have been doing at 1 a.m, because we're the only two working on a lot of this stuff.
And I just want to add to that too, Jeff, that the learning, the capacity to learn with when you partner with a firm like Evernorth is diminished, because they do so much and they already know, and to slow down any process to help us learn doesn't typically happen as quickly. Whereas if you work with a consultant developer, yeah, you're learning. You're learning quickly.
So let's talk for a moment about how you learn. If you've never developed affordable housing before, where do you begin? What resources are out there that you can use to become familiar with and get with the process, the terminology, the language, and also get connected with people and funding sources? Mary, would you like to start?
Sure. I was fortunate to walk into an organization that had done development in the past. So I didn't have to start from scratch as far as the resources. The state partners already were familiar with our organization. And it's seeking out webinars like this, or or other sources of material that can just, the acronyms alone are difficult and challenging. So and then of course being present at development meetings, and as Jeff had said in the past, you sit at this table, you don't have any idea what they're talking about, and as soon as everybody leaves the room, you go figure it out. You find out, you take good notes. Not one source.
Jeff?
Two things that were really helpful for us. I mentioned earlier there's a trade association in Colorado for affordable housing, and it's called Housing Colorado, and they have an annual conference and then events through the year, and different training opportunities. And that was really, really helpful for us, though the first time that I attended one of those conferences, it reminded me of being in algebra in ninth grade, where I'm just sure everyone else in the room knows what the teacher is talking about except me. But as it turns out, there was a bunch of other people who were just sitting there kind of drinking through the fire hose and trying to figure it out also. And then the state of Colorado has what they call a toolkit. It's like a 3-day training opportunity where people who are beginning to learn about the development process can come and as a group walk through a fictional development project from beginning to end. And that was really helpful as well, because you begin to see how the puzzle comes together. So those were two of the best things, and I would presume that in other states there's some version of each of those things.
And
So try and I'm sorry, Mary, go ahead.
I was just going to add too that Vermont doesn't have that, or not that I'm aware of, and that would be super helpful. But also, I have found that the funders themselves are really helpful with information, calling and asking the questions that you don't understand. I have found across the board with all the funding sources that, asking the questions to them is helpful as well.
Okay, so most states have some sort of trade organization that maybe holds affordable housing conferences in their state. Is that true? And then maybe your state housing finance agency and their website. And how about city and counties? Do they have people, organizations, websites you can reach out to as well?
Yeah, that's the case here locally. Yeah, our Colorado Housing Finance Authority has a lot of training that's available. And our staff has begun to take advantage of all of that. And again, at first, it's a little overwhelming because you feel like you don't know anything. But I ran into one of our employees yesterday in the hall, and she says, "Hey, I'm about to complete a certification in affordable housing management." She gives me a big high five, like, "Look at me, I'm learning this stuff." And she's done that, just done that work through the Housing Finance Authority. So.
I think we also have a slide in the presentation that lists some additional resources and HUD resources where people can go to find additional information as well. I'm not sure if we're going to be showing that slide or not. I'd like to ask my colleague, Tony Gallo, who's been monitoring the questions. If she has, Tony, do you have any questions for our panelists that they could answer?
Yes, I do, but I am showing the information and resources slide now. So if you wanted to go over those first, and then I'll field you some questions.
Sure. This is just a few of the resources that are out there. The HUD Exchange is an excellent source for information, and then most of the HUD offices have their own web sites as well. But these four here in particular are sources that people may want to check out that can be found on the HUD Exchange website. So we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. Tony, if there are a couple of questions out there that you thought were particularly good questions that could be answered by our panelists, could you share those with us, please?
Sure. So this first one that I'm going to give you is a really good one. And you talked a little bit about it, but it's specifically about pre-development and development expenses. So where does funding come from for pre-development and development expenses such as architects and lawyers? Do public funds provide funding for these types of expenses?
I can answer it from our perspective. Our Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, again, our mother housing organization at the state level, does provide some funding. I think it's a $20,000 grant in order to start feasibility. That's one source. The Community Development Block Grant Program also does planning grants that we could access. The Vermont Housing Finance Agency might be willing to give us a loan for some pre-development expenses, but of course that does need to be paid back. If the project doesn't go through, it still needs to be paid back. And recently, when I took over 2 years ago, we decided to create a fund within the organization and do some fundraising, and that is specifically for pre-development dollars. And one of our takes on that was that if somebody were to donate, and we mostly went to businesses who are, having a crisis, not being able to hire people because we don't have enough housing. But we said if you contribute to this fund, this pre-development fund, when the project does go through and gets closed, then the money gets paid back, and so there's a good portion that will continue to live in each affordable project that we do. So we're trying to build that fund so that we do have quick access to capital when we need to get site control for something or, take advantage. And then, of course, the longer term pre-development attorneys and architects, et cetera.
It's a really good question because this is the scary time when you're spending money on a project that may never come to be. And that's a little unnerving. In our case, we were raising private philanthropy. We were intending to use that money primarily for site acquisition, but we were spending that money in advance to do the pre-development work and trusting that it would come back to us when the rest of our funding came together. So it is a risk that you're spending money in advance. We also had some funding from foundations and from some individuals from donor advised funds and program related investments. They were making these impact loans to us, very low interest rate, like 1% loans with 5-year terms that were specifically for to help us with pre-development funds. But again, we have to pay those back when we convert our construction financing to permanent funding.
All right, we've got about 4 minutes left, Tony. What's the next question, please?
Okay, so this is an interesting one. How do you identify property?
That's a hard one. You know, each project is different. Sometimes it's the real estate that draws you and you figure out the project. Sometimes it's the need you're trying to fill, where, you know, if you're trying to address the homelessness or if you want to create something in a particular town. I can't say that there's one path that leads us to a particular piece of property. It all depends.
Yes, we're not, I'm not the best person to speak to that either from this project, just in the sense that we began with the piece of property. That's what we had, that motivation before we were thinking about affordable housing even. But now it's the question we're going to be thinking about next, because we're starting to say, okay, what should be our next property? And I tell you, in Denver, there is very little vacant property. Development has been so intense in our city. There's very little that's vacant, and there's nothing that's cheap. So, so how you identify the property is a really good question, but I'm afraid I don't have the expertise yet to speak to it.
I still think your responses are very helpful because it's just kind of luck. And Jeff, you had spoken previously when we talked to you about like looking at churches where congregations have been diminishing, have a parking lot that they no longer need.
Yes, that's right. You know, a few years ago, a couple of organizations here in Denver came together and did a study, and they identified that one large source, and maybe one of the final remaining large sources of underutilized land in our city, is with religious congregations. Land they bought thinking that the church might grow, but the church didn't grow the way they thought that it would. Or at a time when the congregation was bigger, they built a big parking lot, and now the congregation is small, and in some cases the property is even being used for other purposes. So it sits empty much of the time. But I think religious congregations it's not been part of the thinking for everybody. It has for some, but not for everybody, to think, how else might we use this land and be good stewards of it? But I think there's some growing energy around that in our city and some other places across the country. So I think that's going to be really important in the future.
So it looks like we might have to wrap it up there. I would like to, we're hoping that this may turn into a series of webinars. I know that there's a lot more that we could, in-depth information that we could go into. But I, again, want to thank Minnie Monroe Baldwin and HUD's Office of Recapitalization, and our panelists, Jeff Johnson and Mary Cohen. We greatly appreciate your sharing this knowledge, important knowledge and information with all the aspiring affordable housing developers that are out there. So with that, we will conclude today's webinar. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.